Okay, so now that we've done the intro video and we talked a little bit about why reading scientific papers is important, let's start to talk about what the different parts are of scientific papers, which will then give us a foundation for how to read them effectively. So this is what we're going to go through today. So here on the right, we have an image of what a very nicely formatted scientific paper looks like. So we'll talk a little bit about the title, which you can find right here, the abstract, which is right here. And again, we'll go through each of these different components of a paper and what they mean, but just to show you as an overview, when you're looking at a journal article, this is usually where you can find each of those pieces of information. The keywords are right here. Introduction starts here. Methods, results, and discussion are going to be on later pages, so they're not visible on this main front page of the article. Just other things for reference here. Here at the top, this is the journal name, so just where that particular paper was published. And then the authors are right here. If you're thinking that we've already heard about snails, you're right, but we're going to talk about the paper again. Okay, so that's just a brief layout for you to show you where the different parts of information are on the front page of an article, and then we'll talk about each of these different components of the paper in detail. So this is what we're calling the structure of a scientific paper, or the different components of it. So let's start with the title. So the title should be self-explanatory, meaning that if someone who hasn't read your paper reads your title, they should have a general idea of what that paper is about. So the title uses descriptive terms and phrases that are going to really convey and highlight that main content of the paper. So here we have some examples to help illustrate what should be listed there in the title. So first we have a bad example. So sad face. If you hear that noise, that's my dog scratching his ear. He's sitting under my desk as I record this. Okay, so a bad example is a biology lab report. So that's bad because it's not very descriptive, right? That could be about anything. Biology is a really big field. Lab report, that could be for any lab. So that's not very self-explanatory, right? Or not very descriptive. Okay, a better example here, we're starting to get a little bit better. Here we have effects of environmental factors on the growth of Prochlorococcus marinus, or effects of light and temperature on the growth of an organism. So if you look here, again, this is definitely more descriptive than this bad example up here. But these words highlighted in red here, environmental factors and organism, those still are pretty vague. Environmental factors could be lots of different things. Organism could be any different organism. So if we then improve on that, if we look here at the best example at the bottom, so the best example of a title for this particular paper would be something like the effects of light and temperature. So here we're being specific about what kind of environmental factors we're talking about. We're talking about light and temperature on the growth of the marine bacterium Prochlorococcus marinus. So here, instead of just saying organism, we're being specific about what that organism is. Another thing to note here is that anytime you have the scientific name of an organism in the title, it's a good idea to also give a little bit of information about what that generally what the organism is. So when I write papers about Chlorosoma funabralis, which is the snail that I work with, I almost always first say the inner title, marine snail, Chlorosoma funabralis. And that's because people who don't work on your organism aren't going to be familiar with that scientific name necessarily. So if you also say generally what type of organism it is, someone who's reading your paper, not necessarily in your exact field, can still know what the paper is about. So that was a title. Next here we have the abstract, and the abstract is super important It contains 4 main types of information: the purpose of the paper, so why the authors did this study, the methodology or how the study was done, the results, so what was found, and then lastly the conclusion, so what it all means. So here on the right I have an abstract. Mad Libs, I don't know if any of you have done that before, but Mad Libs is where you fill in random adjective and then you end up with funny paragraphs. The idea here being that these main kinds of information should all be present in an abstract. So we'll talk about each of those different things. So here's an example from one of the fish egg papers that we've worked with before. And so if you see, it's color-coded according to what different part of that abstract is being addressed. So if we go back here, so red is the purpose. So here, this is the purpose of the study. So it's telling us, in general, they did ichthyoplankton, which are fish egg and larvae, surveys to provide monitoring of ecosystems. Okay, so that is the why. In green, we have the methodology, so how the study was conducted. So here it says they did weekly fish egg collections, and it gives details about where those collections were done, what years, etc. And then also it gives a little bit more information about the wet lab part, so they use DNA barcoding in order to assess the data. The blue is the results, so the what. So this summarizes what was found, and then lastly in purple, which unfortunately I don't have purple, oops, okay, and that's my timer to remind myself to pause after 7 minutes. They've done studies that show if you're watching videos or sitting in lecture, you only have about a 5 to 7 minute attention span. So I'll finish this slide and then give you a little break. Okay, so the last part here is the conclusion. So just pretend this is purple. And so this here is talking about what the results mean, right? So this describes a little bit more broadly what are the implications of this. So here, this last sentence of the abstract talks about potentially affecting climate change, marine resources, management. So these are different broader implications for the study. Okay, so I'm gonna pause for a second, let you take that all in, take a stretch break, whatnot. I can pet my dog who's sitting underneath me. So go ahead, take a little bit of a break. Okay, welcome back. Hope you had a little bit of a mini break. Okay, now after talking about the abstract, we're going to talk about the keywords or key phrases. So these are used to classify and organize the journal article. So it gives information about the article. So generally there are 4 or 6 keywords per article. Contrary to the name keywords, it doesn't actually have to be one word. So that's why it's sometimes they're called key phrases. And in general, what these keywords are is they're telling what field of work this study belongs to, what techniques or methods were used, what organisms were studied, the main findings. And so again, the point of these keywords is someone either searching for your article, or when the journal's trying to categorize your article, it helps to give a bit of information about what the main parts of the paper are. So here are some examples using that same fish egg paper, Duke et al. 2018. Some of those keywords were fish spawning, DNA barcoding, ichthyoplankton, and long-term monitoring. Another example from a paper by Claro et al. 2016, where they were looking at growth mindset. And I think we've talked about this before, but growth mindset is this idea that no one's intelligence is fixed. So what that means is if you work really hard and practice, you can increase your learning, which is true for everyone. And so they actually very interestingly found that in this paper, if you have a growth mindset, it can help to offset the negative effects of poverty. So for that particular paper, The keywords were mindset, academic achievement, income inequality, and education equality. So those are some examples of keywords for different papers. So the first main part of the actual text, the main text of an article is the introduction. And there are two main purposes of an introduction. One is to create reader interest, so you want to convince people who are just starting to read the paper in the introduction to make it all the way through the paper. And secondly, you want to provide the information and the background that's needed for someone who's reading the article to understand it. So there are three main types of information that are within the introduction. So we're using this little funnel analogy here, where first you start with broadly the information that is known, and then you switch to specific things, so what is not known, and then you get really narrow and you talk about specifically what question the authors are trying to answer in that particular study. Okay, so we'll go broad, specific, and then focal point, and we'll talk about some examples of that in published papers. So this is still from Duke et al. And here if you start with broad, so what is known, so it talks about how we know that fish egg surveys can be a useful tool. We know that in the past, surveys have been used to document spawning grounds of commercially important species. So when we're talking first in the introduction, we want to start with a broad information, so things that we already know. And then for specific things, then we talk about what isn't known. So if you look at the examples that are pulled here, it talks about how it has been difficult to determine which species were spawning, how in the second bullet point here there's less information about specific spawning patterns, how they might change with environmental variation. So when we're talking about, after we've given the broad information in the introduction, what is known, then we go in a little bit narrower to the specific information, so what isn't known. And then lastly, we get to the focal point, which is talking about this particular study. And you can see how these all kind of tie together, right? So we know fish egg surveys are useful, but they're not very useful for identifying particular species. Here in this particular paper, we are specifically documenting spawning activity in this particular marine protected area. So the aim is to document changes in spawning activity and to start to assess habitat-specific patterns. So if we go back to our funnel, this focal point is right here, the very most specific part. So you would end your introduction talking about the specific goals or aims of this particular study. And I'll pause again there because I'm just about to come up on my 7 minutes. So pause, stand up, maybe take a brief walk around wherever you are. Come back in a second. Welcome back. Okay, so after the introduction, the next part of a paper is the methods. And here, what we're looking at in these papers is a description of what experiments were done. So that includes information such as how you got the samples, what your experimental design was, and Dr. Visker is going to talk about this later in the semester. We're going to do some fun activities with research questions and experimental design. In the methods, it also, you want to give information about what equipment you used, how you gathered your data, the type of data analysis you did. So if you think back to the different statistical tests we've talked about, so t-test, ANOVA, you want to have a section in your methods that explains what statistical analyses you use and also what programs you use. So did you use Excel, did you use R, that kind of thing. And then your control, if it's relevant. Here, this picture, if you haven't already heard of this and you have some free time or maybe on your next little break I give you, look up the hashtag overly honest methods. It's really funny, and what it is scientists just giving you the really honest reason for why they did things the way they did. We scientists, of course, always want to be as rigorous and scientific as possible. Every once in a while, though, you end up with logistical limitations that you just have to work with. So for this overly honest methods example, this scientist is saying that their spectrophotometer, they used one particular temperature because it was July and it was hot and it wouldn't go any lower. So that's what they used. So an example of methods, here again we're pulling from that same paper. Oftentimes the methods sections are broken up into mini sections to help the reader follow. So in this particular paper, the fish egg paper we've been talking about, for the methods section, it was broken up into 3 different parts: sampling locations and techniques. So again, you're saying how you got the samples, processing eggs, PCR, and sequencing. So those are the wet lab methods, basically. And then the last section is data analysis. So again, how did they analyze that data? So the next section after the methods typically is the results, which we've talked a little bit about last week. We talked about writing results. And so in the results section, the main thing you're doing is presenting your data. That can be in 2 different visual formats, either in tables or in figures. Here in the results section, we're not interpreting the results. So we'll talk about that in the next section. So here you're just conveying your results as they are, right? And then in addition to these visuals that you have in the text portion, you're describing the data that's presented in these visuals and calling attention to important data that will be referenced in the discussion. So we'll talk about that next and use to support any of your conclusions. So these are some examples of tables and figures in that Duke et al. 2018 fish egg paper. So here on the left is an example of a table where we're showing the different years, the average temperature, water temperature. Here on the right, in figure 6, they're looking at the potential correlation or relationship between the average winter temperature and the number of fish eggs in the spring and summer. So the 2 examples of visuals in a results section. And then after the results section, typically the last part of the paper is the discussion. And so if you come back to this hourglass analogy we talked about before, in the introduction we said it went from broad to specific. Here in the discussion, this is where we bring it back out again and make it broader, and you talk about how your particular results fit in the context of what has already been done, what's already known. So this is where you're interpreting the data. So putting that data in the broader context, again, that relates to this hourglass here. So some of the things you talk about in the broader context, how your results may differ from your hypothesis, whether your hypothesis was supported or not. Another really big aspect of the broader context is how your results compare to other people's results who have done similar types of studies. In the discussion, often you answer any question from the intro, so that last part of the introduction where you're saying your specific aims for the study, you'd want to come back to that in the discussion. You would want to explain any results that you observed. So again, in the results, you're just telling the results. In the discussion, you want to explain them more thoroughly, again, based on literature and what other people have found. And another really important thing to do in the discussion is acknowledge your limitations. So no study is perfect and no study can do everything. So there are always little caveats that you have to think about, and that's totally fine to acknowledge them. And you should acknowledge them. So we'll show some examples of each of these different parts of a discussion section. Using our same favorite fish egg paper. So we said one of the things you want to do in a discussion is put your data and findings in a broader context. And one of the ways to do that is to compare to others' results. And so first, you might want to talk about the differences between your results and other people's results. So there are two examples here. And I've highlighted in bold some of the words that you can look for and that indicate that they're comparing their results and how the results are different to other people. So that first bullet point, they talk about how they compared to previous spawning data, they actually found a decline of 50%. In the second bullet point, they explain what has been found previously, and then they say, in contrast, our data actually shows something different and there was no apparent change of spawning. So this is an example of the discussion section where you can compare how your results are different from other people's. And I just had my cue to give you another small little break if you want to go look up overly honest methods, and then we'll come back and continue talking about the discussion in a second. Okay, hope you had a little laugh, a little break. Okay, so when you are talking about your results in your discussion section, you want to talk about how your results may be different from what other people have found. You also want to talk about how they're similar to what other people have found. So again, here highlighted in bold, consistent with our study, other people have found similar things. So you want to indicate if there are any other results that further support what you have found in your particular study. We also talked about how in the discussion section you want to answer any questions that you first pose in the introduction. So for this particular paper, they were trying to look at how spawning differs across years and whether that was related at all to environmental variability or environmental differences. So in the discussion, they talk about how over 2 warm years, they did see a really big decline in spawning. And they also found that a lot of this variability in fish egg abundance was indeed associated with big climatic differences. And El Nino, I can't remember if we talked about that before, it's just a warm water event that we see happening much more frequently now due to climate change. But it's basically events where you have warmer ocean water than usual. Another thing you want to talk about in your discussion section is explaining your observed results. So what that means is, as we just saw in the previous slide, the authors indicate that there was a reduced spawning activity. So next, those authors would want to explain potential causes for that. So here in bold, we have that spawning activity could be the result of one of the things they're talking about here, and then they cite other papers that could indicate what the reasoning for that is. And here's another example. The authors say a third potential explanation for the decreased abundance could be this. And here they're talking about a shift in spawning location. These shifts are actually happening pretty frequently throughout marine organism ranges, where as you have climate change and warmer water, the location of warmer waters is moving. Animals are moving along with them in order to track or get away from that warmer water. But in general here, for this example, they're talking about potential explanations for the results that were observed. So you're not just saying the results, you're explaining them a little bit more. And we also said you want to acknowledge your limitations, right? So in this particular study, they were looking at only several years. So they say they found a positive relationship, but to really test that, you need additional sampling years. So again, you always want to acknowledge your limitations. Say we have so far indications that there are positive relationships between these two factors. If we really wanted to confirm that, test that further, we would need additional sampling years. Okay, and that's it. So hopefully now you have a better idea about the structure of a scientific paper and what information is in each of these different sections. So next you have a few activities on Canvas to help you solidify this information, and then we have a few other videos as well. So go ahead and go to Canvas, and then I'll see you for the next video.